Hello, good morning and welcome. Great to see so many of you on the line today. This is the penultimate webinar of the year for Property Master. As you know, we've been running these webinars now for, well, over a year, trying to keep you up to speed with the latest developments in the buy-to-let mortgage market and the private rented sector in general. Today's theme is energy efficiency, and I can see by the numbers that have logged on for this one, we've got the timing about right. I don't think anyone could have missed the COP26 meeting beginning actually this weekend. And of course, we're seeing lots of media coverage on energy efficiency issues, how the government wants to improve the energy efficiency of our homes, and obviously being landlords, we're wondering where the bill for that is going to land, and I can see there's some concern that it will be us picking up that bill. So I'm delighted today. I've got with us Damien Roberts. Hi Damien. Damien has stepped in at the last minute for Fiona, his colleague who is sadly ill, but I've been chatting away to Damien and he's well up for it today. So welcome Damien. You're from Elmhurst Energy and you're one of the biggest companies for EPC assessors. I think that's right.
It is correct. Yes, thank you. Yes, nice to meet you all, everyone. So, as Christine said, my name's Damien Roberts. I work for Elmhurst Energy. Elmhurst Energy are an accreditation and training body, and we are the largest in our industry. And we support around just over 7,000 members. So, yeah, it's very positive with EPCs at the moment. What's
Fantastic.
going on?
Lots of interest in it, as I can see, as questions coming in already. Thank you for that, Dame. You know, just to remind everyone, we will be recording the session, so if people do have to duck out and can't stay to the end, we will send a recording out if you are on our system. If you are not on our system and want a recording, please do email us at info@property-master.com. Any questions, pop them in the chat box, or there is the ask a question box at the bottom. So I'm now going to go over to, as we always do, our Chief Executive, Angus Stewart, who's just going to give us a bit of an update on what's going on in the mortgage market. And of course, we've had the budget. We've got the Bank of England meeting next week. We're seeing interest rates rising. So Angus has been kind of busy. Do you want to give us a little bit of an update, Angus, on what is going on at the moment?
Well, morning, Christine, morning, Damien, and morning, everybody. Yeah, well, it's interesting times we live in. As you said, timing of this webinar with COP26 next week is very deliberate from our side because it is clearly a key issue for everybody. And you'll have seen recently that the government's announced that there will be some grants to help people put heat pumps into their residential properties. I'm sure we'll get more conversations on that later. But what is more worrying is that there are 3.2 million private rented properties which are a D or below. I think in total there's probably best part of 20 million properties that are D or below, and the government has kindly offered £5,000 starting from next April, which I believe only covers 90,000 properties, the amount. So there seems to be a big mismatch and a big gap in terms of support that might be available to people and what the government's able to provide. So I'm sure we'll hear more on that later from Damien. The budget, well, didn't we escape? I think that's certainly my feeling. I think landlords, if it had been a Labour Party budget, would have been targeted, but we seem to escape. What is interesting is that there was a proposal from the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, to increase stamp duty for second properties and holiday lets to 4% from the current 3% surcharge, and that hasn't been announced, which I think is great news. So I think we've escaped that with the skin of our teeth, but maybe it's something that's going to come back later. We'll see. Also within that OBR report is a view that interest rates may be 3.5% in a couple of years, and whilst we're starting to see interest rates rise, that 3.5% seemed quite a steep increase to me in terms of what they're suggesting. And if it's right, I think as landlords there is a big question there in terms of cost of mortgages, and it makes me think that we ought to really consider whether we're on the right product, whether we should be looking at remortgaging now, because even with early redemption charges, there may be an argument to do something today and maybe move on to a 5-year fixed rate today, because the rates are going up. We've seen a number of lenders already announce rate increases, and I can only see it getting worse. And if this 3.5% in 2 years does get built into the fixed rate prices over the next couple of months, that is a very substantial increase from a current base rate of 0.1%, with some lenders giving their best rates are around just over the 1% mark at the moment. So I think we're going to see a big shift there. So I think we need to give some real consideration, or landlords need to give some real consideration as to where their products are, whether they should do something earlier. The other bit of interesting news is that the rental reform white paper, which was supposed to come out around now, has been delayed until 2022. The official government view of why they've delayed is they want to give a balanced package of reforms. Well, given one of those reforms was removal of Section 21 non-fault evictions, I think, again, for landlords, that at least gives us a bit of breathing space whilst some of these other changes are considered. So I think, again, so in hindsight, I think this week has been an interesting one for landlords. I think it's been a narrow escape for us on the potential stamp duty increase. We've got a delay to the rental reform white paper, which I think can only be good news for landlords. I prefer them to get it right than rush it, and I think that. And and we're going to talk about energy and energy efficiency and all the great things this £5,000 is going to give us. So, Christine, back to you.
Thanks for that, Angus. Well, it's nice to have some good news. We're not kind of used to good news, so really interesting times. Well, we're going to, obviously, as Angus was talking, questions were coming in, Damien, for you. So there's a lot of interest in EPCs. Well, let's just start with explaining, how does an EPC actually work? How is it calculated?
Shall we start from the beginning, I guess, really? So an energy assessor would visit a property to do an inspection, and that involves going around the property. It's not invasive, and collecting data, i.e. on insulation and heating system, which is highly important. So and then they would enter the data that they collect into software that generates the EPC. So it's quite an in-depth survey, I guess, really, but it is non-invasive. So, they're just collecting all of that information that affects the energy efficiency of a property.
So when they look at energy efficiency, what are they looking at? Are they looking at cost or?
So in terms of the EPC is based on cost, and I think that's probably if we're talking about the EPC itself. The EPC is actually a cost rating. So the energy graph that you see on there is based on predominantly the cost of the fuel that property is using. So, for example, gas, mains gas is relatively low on the scale at the moment, being quite cheap. So that's why you see gas condensing boiler scoring really well. So a property with a gas condensing boiler would score quite well on your EPC. And whereas if you've got something else like an electric fueled appliance, then because electricity is really high in price at the moment, then that's going to fall quite low on the scale when you see your A to G rating.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when you actually get the certificate, how can you use it to improve the energy efficiency of your property?
So you'll see on the EPC that you have some recommended measures. They work in cumulative order. So when an energy assessor is discussing these with their customer, hopefully they would explain how these recommendations work on the EPC. So if you do them in that specific order that they appear, you will achieve what is referred to as the potential rating that you'll see on the graph. And it always works. If you notice the recommendations, they'll always work on a fabric first approach. So what it's effectively doing is the EPC saying to you or the customer, we want you to insulate your property first before you start going down to install your boiler and before you start even get into your renewable energy solutions like your solar PV, things like that.
Mm-hmm. So what are the most sort of common things that your assessors would recommend you do that are fairly maybe in some cases simple to do, cost effective?
The easiest ones. I mean, it is heavily dependent on the circumstances of the person that's living in the property, isn't it? So the homeowner or the tenant. So, but I think some of the easier things that you could do are insulate a hot water cylinder. So you could get a jacket for your hot water cylinder, or if you can, insulate the loft space. Those are quite easy things to do. Maybe improve your heating controls as well. Although that's sort of in the middle of the cost rating, but it is a relatively easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how much, as a landlord, are you expected to spend to try to bring your property up to the potential level that it should be?
So we're talking about MEES now. The cost cap for that for landlords is 3,500 at the moment. A landlord should be looking to look at the EPC. What are the measures that I can do that come under that sort of 3,500, and can I achieve the E rating that I need to let out the property as it currently stands? And if they can, then they should do those easier measures. Like I say, the most cost-effective ones would be your loft insulation and your cylinder insulation if there is a hot water cylinder. And then, so it's those kind of things that you'll be looking at. And if a landlord says that actually there's have no recommendations that fall under that category, my property is quite well insulated anyway, but it's my first recommendation is actually to install a new boiler. And I've got some quotes, and the new boiler is actually coming in at £4,000, for example. Then an exemption can be applied for. Then you can apply for an exemption on the PRS register.
Ah, right. So is that something that's relatively simple to do online? How would you apply for an exemption?
So yes, it is online. So the PRS exemptions register is an online facility, and a landlord would have to register their details to set up an account. So imagine I'm sure a lot of the landlords here have got probably good portfolios of properties, so it's worth them having an account on there anyway. It's relatively simple to do. It's something the government run, and it's monitored and policed by environmental health departments. So and in that example I just gave, a landlord would need to get at least three quotes, and if they all come in at above 3,500 for that particular one measure that they've only got on their EPC, then they can apply for an exemption. And the exemption lasts 5 years, so they've got a 5-year grace then to actually look to do all the things to the property eventually.
Right. Are there any other exemptions? Any other properties that could claim an exemption for various reasons?
Yeah, there are. So the first one, the easiest one, is like I've just described. Well, actually, not like I've just described. That's one point. But the other one is I've done some of these recommendations. I'm now sort of at the border of my 3,500 limit, but now I'm going to go over that. If I do the next one, well, in that case, then you've got to the limit, and it's still in the F4G banding. That means then you can still apply for your exemption, because if I go over that limit, then by all means, landlords can go over that limit if they choose to. It's their option. But there is this cap that says actually you don't have to in the legislation.
Okay. Right. Well, let's take some of the questions we've got coming in. Alex posted this question yesterday. And we talked about it before we went online, Damien. It's more complex than I thought. Could you let me know your thoughts on tenancies that started before the EPC regulations were introduced and are continuing on a periodic basis?
So yeah, this is a tricky area, and we were discussing it earlier. So, and I think so this question is quite specific actually. So I think what they're saying is that there was never an EPC on the property. So before the EPC legislation came into effect. So in effect, you've probably got a sitting tenant in there that may have been on a long-term let, for example, for I don't know, 20 years or something like that. So that property would never have required an EPC. Then it doesn't reach a trigger point. So it only needs an EPC when or if that tenant ever decides to vacate the property and the landlord has to remarket it to find a new tenant. And in that case, then it depends what rating you get on the EPC. So yeah, then you'd probably have to look at, if it's F or G, I'm going to have to increase it to an E or a D or whatever. So,
yeah, it's interesting.
It's a complex area.
Yeah, because what the government is saying is it wants to raise all properties to a C by 2028, but there's no obvious trigger for Alex to do that at the moment.
Well, yeah. So what we've obviously, we speak to the government quite often, we lobby them quite often, and what we've said is that actually there is no way of capturing these. How are you supposed to know? How are the government supposed to know, or us, that these properties exist? There's no trigger for it. There's no EPC in it on it already. So unless there's some kind of register that is put into place that is actually publicly nationwide that we can see, then yeah, there is, at the moment there's nothing. So we are actually speaking to government and saying, look, this is a real grey area, and you need to sort of define what you mean by this.
Because a lot of properties are mortgage free as well, so that takes out that trigger too.
Yeah, you would think they could link it back to the land registry in some way.
Well, these are the things that we're considering, and you would hope so, wouldn't you? So that is definitely one viable option.
So hopefully that helps, Alex. It wasn't as straightforward as I thought. Interesting one.
I've got one quick question for you, Damien. You said that the EPC was related to the cost of the fuel. Do you assume, for example, you mentioned gas, do you assume a particular price of gas for an EPC? And what's happened, given we've had a significant increase in price of gas over the last few weeks, does that change the EPC calculation, and in which way does it affect it?
So yeah, the fuel prices that you have in the calculation. So we are getting into the depths of how it's all calculated now. But yeah, just to try and keep it simple. So that graph that you see, like I said earlier, is based on the cost of the fuel that the property is using. So and the fuel price is set within the calculation. They will change every 6 months. So they are updated by the Building Research Establishment from in January. And then those fuel prices will run until June, and then July to December you'll get a new set of fuel prices which will be updated. So at the moment for mains gas, the fuel prices for mains gas, you're probably looking at about 4.1 pence per kilowatt hour, as opposed to electricity. If you're just on standard rate electricity and you're using a electric panel heater or something like that to heat your property, then you're going to be looking at something like about 17 pence per kilowatt hour. So as you can imagine, that factor where you've got a low price, your rating is going to score really high or quite high. Whereas if you've got your electricity 16, 17 pence per kilowatt hour, then you're going to be sort of scoring quite low. And that is, like we were discussing earlier on, that is something that is apparent in the heating building strategy now. So the government are aware of it and trying to balance those out in the future, and that's where decarbonisation comes in.
Because if the EPCs are about cost, they're not about carbon, then are they necessarily? So do you think they'll make that change? Will that to rebalance the EPC in the way it's calculated?
I think that is so. The consultation that was in place at the beginning of the year that actually we were discussing earlier, and that it suggests all these changes around the thresholds for MEES and moving it up from D to C and those kind of things. Within that consultation, it also said, what do we do about the metrics, as we call them? So the graph that you see is a metric, and they were consulting on, do we want the carbon graph again? Because that used to be there. There used to be an environmental impact graph. And do we include other graphs as well? So we will, yeah. In the answer to your question, I think yes, definitely something needs to happen with the EPC to show these different metrics in place. So I think the government needs to be aware, and our industry as well, that actually there are more every time a policy comes into place. We need to be certain what it's focusing on. Are we trying to reduce fuel poverty, make sure that people are living in nicer, warmer homes and they're not spending a fortune on their bills? Are we wanting to reduce carbon, which is obviously the big topic at the moment? You know, the government are heavy on this, and lots of things going on to try and get us to net zero. And then you've also got the other aspect of energy use. So that could be a new metric.
This perhaps picks up on a question from Ivan. What is being done to improve the reliability of EPCs to make it suitable to support investment decisions?
Yeah, it does link into that, doesn't it? And I think there's lots of things in the EPC. I mean, it changed last year, in September of last year. So the register changed from landmark to government. And that meant actually the content of the EPC, some of it disappeared, and because it's now an online facility, EPC is online, which is a great thing because actually it does allow us or the government to introduce new things quicker. So they can add extra items to it, and if they think it's a good policy, they can add things into it or remove things. And I think one of the things that we find in our industry is that there is a misconception in the description of the EPC. I don't know if I'm sure the landlords have seen stuff and
you seem to have lost Damien.
Damien's right. Are you back, Damien?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
You disappeared for a moment. Yeah.
Okay.
Keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know where I got to. What was I saying? So,
you were talking about the making EPCs more reliable and more suitable to support investment decisions.
He seems to have frozen again.
Oh, well, let's go over to you, Angus. I mean, a lot of lenders have been coming out with green mortgages. How do they work, and are they worth it?
Well, the government is trying to incentivise lenders to improve the quality of the housing stock, and my understanding is that they are being obliged or expected to get to the point where a significant proportion, say at least half their lending, is on properties of a C or above, and therefore one of the ways of doing that is to incentivise landlords to come to them with better rates on products, and also to give some lending to actually help improve the efficiency of the properties which are being underwritten or providing mortgages for them. So so many lenders now have introduced green mortgages over the last few months, and they generally have a lower interest rate. Quite a lot of them now have got completely comparable products. You know, if you're a C or above, you can have this product and it's identical, other than a cheaper price, to others, to the existing mortgage. So that encourages the landlord to go for a C. And if you use the Property Master system and you put in the EPC of your property, we have amended Property Master to actually show you those better products that are available in the market if you've got a grade C or above. And so we now take into consideration the EPC grade for any property.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's good news. What do we think is going to happen? I mean, there are clearly a lot of landlords on the line who are concerned about getting their properties up to the C. What will happen by 2028 to the properties that can't be got up to that level? Do we know? What will lenders do?
Well, as I said, I think the lenders are being encouraged to do a proportion of their properties, or which will be C or above. I think we all recognise that there are properties out there that can't get to a C or above. If you've got a Grade 2 listed property, you're not allowed to change the windows or do this or that, then you're going to have to get an exemption. So it will be a lower rating, but with an exemption. And I think the issue here is we need to encourage as many people to move, or that's what the government's trying to do, to improve the energy efficiency of their properties. And as a result, the lender's book as a whole will move up in terms of being an average of a D or an E to an average of somewhere between C and D perhaps, but they are looking to improve at a portfolio level the average rating. But there will still be properties in beyond 2028 which are below the C. There has to be.
Yeah, and so there's been speculation we may end up with green mortgage prisoners, people who cannot move or are stuck on a standard variable rate. I mean, do you think that might happen?
I'm not convinced about green mortgage prisoners per se. I think there will always be lenders out there who recognise that the property is mortgageable, especially if you can get the rental income. It may not hit the EPC guidance, so you'd probably pay a premium in terms of price. And I don't think it would be anything different to the myriad of other criteria where you've got some lenders who will recognise that they are willing to lend. I mean, I'd say the pressure on the lenders is to have a balanced portfolio of properties rather than all properties. So if they've got a number which are C and above, then there's no reason why they can't have some which are less energy efficient within that portfolio. So I don't think we're going to see mortgage prisoners per se, but you might pay slightly more for what you're getting.
Yeah. We're still struggling with Damien here. I'm just going to see whether he's got back to me on email. He's obviously having some connection issues, which happens to us all from time to time.
I've removed him from the screen. Let's see if we
can get him back in. But we've got some questions on heat pumps that I know you and I have been talking about, so we can. Let's see if I've got anything from him. Apologies, everyone. I'm afraid the web's not on our side. He's just emailed me to say he thinks he's back now.
Okay,
let's see if we can get him back.
I'm just looking. I've got him on. I'll try and invite him back in. And he's back.
Hello, you're back, Damien.
I hope you had a good trip, Damien. Wherever you went.
Disappeared into cyberspace there. Yeah, I've got loads of questions for you.
Okay. Funnily enough, I could still hear you guys.
Oh, okay. Well, you heard it. We just covered the green mortgage market to a degree. We've got a question here from Grant. I had an EPC renewal, and the property is identical to 10 years ago. It's a small one-bedroom flat. However, the EPC has changed from a B to a D. How can the energy efficiency have changed?
Okay, so that's probably the cost of the fuel. So in 10 years' time, you can imagine that I suggested earlier on that the fuel prices change every 6 months. So it's probably fluctuations in the cost of the fuel. And also over the 10-year period that we've had, you've also had some software updates as well, because the software is referred to as RDSAP, and we've gone through 5 or 6 different versions of that in that 10-year period. It's introduced new things, which some of them are good, some of them inadvertently reduce the energy rating, believe it or not. So that is probably the reason why.
That's really interesting. It does go back to what you were saying earlier, Damien. It may be related to the cost of fuel, but then you say there's some software updates. How long does an EPC certificate last?
10 years. Life cycle is 10 years.
Oh, that might be why Grant's asking the question. I mean, is there any advice you can give to Grant if maybe he's marketing his property now and is surprised to find that's where he is?
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's not. But again, it's this getting the information out there to the members of the public, so the consumer, the people that are using EPC, so they understand what's going on. I would just suggest that if he's got any recommendations on there, then it can look at improving the property in any way. But I would say that actually going forward, with the changes that are happening, if a new EPC is put into place, maybe in a year or so's time, then actually you'll probably find the rating is again increased, because we are about to go through another version update, which is going to introduce lots of new things. So
it's worth knowing that it isn't sort of set in stone. That's really interesting. There's a question here from Stephen in the Q&A box. I spoke to a local EPC guy, and he said he is 99.9% certain that the goal of a C will be revised to a D, as Victorian terrace housing will not get to the C mark. Be good to know what we are expected to achieve. Knowing where we need to get to will greatly impact whether I sell my final 3 properties and serve notice on my tenants. Well, that really brings it home to you, doesn't it? What landlords are facing at the moment. Do you think a C is going to be revised to a D, or the government set on a C, Damien? I'm putting you on the spot there.
Well, to be honest, I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know. Well, I would say that from our perspective, what we have said is that whilst we believe it is a good thing, we do need to be mindful of the impact it's going to have on landlords. And as long as the government communicates it in a way that gives the landlords time, and there is a time period in there where they can get these things done, then, and the exemptions policy as well should change so that it allows landlords to apply for exemptions in an easier fashion, but it's still well policed. Then they can still rent their property out and actually spend a bit of time then looking on how to improve it, because I think it's listed buildings as well, which there may be a question on that at some point, because that all fits together in that, because as we know, some listed buildings can't have some measures.
So I think at the moment, Stephen, it's interesting to see how sort of fluid the situation is. I don't know how long you can wait before making that decision. Angus, have you got any views, any advice on Stephen's dilemma?
Well, I mean, I think if Stephen's in a position where it's not cost effective for him to upgrade his properties to a C, it is logical for him to go down the exemption route. That will then be accepted by lenders. So, again, you may not get quite as good a rate because there's pressure on the lenders to encourage the improvement of properties, hence the green mortgages that are coming out. But the government can't afford, if we've got 3.2 million rented properties there which are a D or below, they can't afford landlords to make them all, to evict all these tenants. I mean, so there needs to be a solution there. So I think that, there has to be a carrot, and I'm not convinced that a £5,000 grant for heat pumps is sufficient carrot for everybody to actually get them where they need to get to. But I think the government needs to work with the sector to get the right solution in here. But it is going to be impossible for every property to get to that C or above, because we know we have old housing stock. We know some of that stuff. I think the bigger issue which the government should be focusing upon is that any new builds should be mandated to meet the highest of standards from day one. And I don't see that at the moment in legislation. And for me, they ought to be saying, as we renew housing stock, let's force the change. And that would then start balancing up at a national level to make to compensate for those properties which can never get there. So I do think it's a bigger issue. I do think levelling up for the Department of Housing needs more than just sort of balancing up geographically. I think it is balancing up housing stock and energy efficiency and so on. And hopefully there's some communication going back from you, Damien, and your colleagues, that the government needs to look a bit more broadly than these sort of sticker, it's got to be a C and that's the answer. We need to find other ways of doing it.
It's encouraging to hear from you, Damien, that there is a lot of dialogue going on with government. And I think in your introductory remarks as well, Angus, we've seen a couple of times within the last few days when it seems as if government is listening a bit more to what landlords say. And I think that's really, that's encouraging. Let's see, we've got another question here from Ross. A property with solid walls, if it is only possible to internally insulate some external walls, for instance where there is a fitted tiled kitchen or bathroom, how does the assessor score the insulation? Is 50mm insulation minimum to qualify for insulated assessment? Sometimes with old properties it's not feasible due to door frames and window frames being hard against walls. So quite a specific question there, Damien. If you want to read it yourself, I think if you click ask a question, you'll be able to see it. It's from Overroth. Just what your views are on that type of insulation and how that might be responded to by an assessor.
I think so. 50 mil is the minimum level of insulation if you're installing internal or external. So anything lower than that, in actual fact, tests have been completed by the BRE that suggest it's not having a significant impact on saving the heat loss, because that's effectively what we're trying to do with insulation, stop the heat from escaping. So, but what an assessor can do when they're out on site, if they know that, and that is quite a specific example around door frames, so I'm not, that's quite complicated, but for it to try to keep it simple, if you've got two walls, one of the walls is insulated, the other is not insulated, then the assessor can split those walls and have an alternative wall, as we call them in the software, to show that's the case. So there are those options. The software is a little bit flexible in those areas to show I've got one wall insulated and one wall that isn't insulated.
Well, that's interesting, because there's a point here from Ivan as well. In my experience, I've had assessors assume no insulation unless they can see it.
Correct.
This has been a problem with pre-existing solid wall and underfloor insulation, even when photos of the installation have been provided. I've heard this one a lot, Damien. What's your view on that?
So, like I said earlier, the EPC is a non-invasive survey. So an energy assessor will visit the property and take evidence of what they can physically see. And using the example of internal wall insulation, that's quite a difficult thing to try and be able to verify that it's there just by your visual inspection. So at that point in time, hopefully the assessor will be asking if there's any documentary evidence like an installer certificate, so they can put that in. I would say in terms of photographs, again, we do say to our assessors, if the landlord or whoever is installing the installation has taken photographs while it's being installed, then they can use that, providing it actually can be verified that it's from the same property. So there might be a feature like a window or a fireplace or something where you can see actually that is the same property, and then the assessor should be able to use that evidence.
Well, that's really useful to know if people have had that work done, or so you need documentary evidence that proves it is the same property.
Yeah, because it is evidence based, you see. So if the assessor can't see it, then they're going to need something else, and hopefully the landlord can help them with that.
Well, there's some learning there for landlords who are doing any improvements to their property.
Correct.
Take lots of pictures so that you can demonstrate in a non-invasive way that you've made the various improvements. Otherwise, the risk is they spend the money, come to the next EPC, and it's not recognised because you can't see it.
Yeah.
So take lots of pictures, everybody.
I think that's the thing, isn't it, as well? And there is what we want as an industry is that there's this. Kind of like a property hub, and we've got something at the moment with Past 2035, which is retrofit, and I know there was a question about that earlier. But what we want is a place where all of this information on properties can be stored and easily accessed by assessors or chartered surveyor or whoever it is trying to create something for that property in terms of the report. and it's all there. They can see it. They still have to visit the property, but at least they can see any documents or anything that relate to that property. And I think that's what we're all aiming towards as an industry.
Yeah, you're right. I missed that one. That was from Adam. Good morning. Will the process of retrofit inspections be explained?
Okay.
So I think is that what we were just saying there, Damien?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. So the process of a retrofit is very complex, and I'm not sure we have enough time to cover it all in this. But I'll try to explain it in a whistle-stop tour if I can. So what will happen is, in theory, a homeowner or a landlord or wherever it is will approach what is referred to as a retrofit coordinator, which is like a project manager. And they say, I want to improve my property. How can I possibly do that to get to this level of D or C, whatever I need to get to? So the coordinator will then instruct a retrofit assessor that has to go and visit the property to do potentially an EPC, but we refer to it as an RDSAP assessment because they don't have to do an EPC necessarily at that stage. But I don't want to complicate the issue, so just focus on the EPC. So they're going out there to do an EPC. They then have to do a condition survey as well. So the retrofit assessor will be there quite some time doing all of this, collecting all of this data. And then that gets transferred over to the coordinator, who then starts to liaise with the landlord or the homeowner, wherever it is, and say, I've created this plan for you, which includes all of these different measures that we think actually may help you. And what the coordinator will do is separate each element out. So it's dependent on, you can do this, or you can do these two things, or you can do these three things. To improve your property to get to where you need to be to. And again, all of that information then gets uploaded to what we refer to as Trustmark, which is like a register, and they house all of that information. And then if it's there to say, this has all been signed off, this is what the property looks like now, but it's still got these other things that you can do to it at a later stage. And then somebody can dip into that information then and say, right, okay, we want to do that installation or want to do that upgrade to it. So hopefully that is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I appreciate it. Hopefully
that's really interesting. Thank you for that, Damien. There's a couple of other questions here. Oh, grade 2 listed buildings, Damien. Are grade 2 listed buildings exempt from EPC requirements or these requirements?
Not in our opinion, no. They aren't exempt from needing an EPC. This is another grey area, and we have covered it. We have created some news articles, actually, because originally, as an industry, we did say that listed buildings were exempt from an EPC, didn't need one. It was always a bit woolly. So probably 2, maybe 3 years ago, we sort of looked at it and actually changed our advice to say listed buildings do actually require an EPC if there is a trigger for them. And that's because there is a conflict in guidance. The government on their website, their guidance actually refers to properties of architectural significance, listed buildings, not requiring an EPC. However, that's not what the legislation says. So the legislation says that listed buildings of architectural significance actually are exempt from certain recommendations. So our opinion is that actually you should still do an EPC if there is a requirement to do one. It is the homeowner's responsibility. So actually, if they decide that they don't want one, then that's up to that person, that landlord or the homeowner, whoever it is. But our advice is that, yes, listed buildings should have an EPC, because how are you supposed to know what recommendations can apply?
But you may not be able to enforce some of those recommendations. That's the issue, I guess.
And from these purposes, that's when you say, well, actually, the conservation officer said, or the planning officer, whoever it is, has said, I can't have new windows, I can't have PV on the roof, those kind of things. Then you apply for your exemption.
Okay, cool. There's a question here from a Dutch investor from Holland. The EPC has a pretty big impact on the value of the property. That must be in Holland. It's in Holland. The EPC has a pretty big impact on the value of the property. Is it the same in the UK? Well, there's been some research suggesting a slight uplift, but I don't know that it would be as significant as it sounds in Holland. What do you think, Damien?
I would say that there has been a bit of research done, and you'll find it in the heating building strategy that's been released. And it probably, the theory is that the analysis suggests it's about 5% that it affects by. So there's not a massive impact that it has on the value of the property. And so, yeah.
It may change. It may change over time. I don't know, Angus. What do you have any views on that from what lenders are thinking about the value of a property?
I think location is such a big issue in the UK in terms of value. I think it's going to take a little while for an EPC to, become a more significant element within that. I mean, I do think that we could get to the point where it is less desirable if you've got a property that doesn't have a reasonable EPC grade. And if you were a landlord looking for new property at the moment, you might be better off looking for something which has got a C or above than trying to take an old property, unless you know that you can through some refurb get it up to a C. And I think you might want to give some thought to EPC as purchase, because you should be able to get some better value downstream from a more energy efficient property. But do I think there's going to be a significant difference in value between, I don't know, a Victorian terraced house in central London, which happens to have one that's an F, as opposed to another property which has got a C or a D? Possibly not, because I think location will be so much bigger an issue.
Different marketplace. We're overrunning a little bit, but I've still got some questions here. Robert, you've been really patient on heat pumps, and I do want to come to that one because there's been so much media coverage about heat pumps. But a question just come in, just to say, my understanding is that the C requirement does not apply to Scotland. Scotland may introduce such regulation, but has not done so yet. This is a question from Derek. What's the situation in Scotland, Damien, or is that outside of your remit?
No. So Scotland do have different policies. So they currently do not have a PRS policy. It keeps being delayed. It was originally supposed to come in pre-COVID, but then obviously the pandemic hit us all, and it was delayed. It's actually being put to their parliament now. So at the moment, it is being mooted that actually it is supposed to be a C, but actually it's being laid before Parliament now. So.
Okay. So we'll have to watch that one, Derek.
I think it's just one to watch.
Yeah. So Robert's question, and we talked about this before we went on live, Damien, about the article that was in the Daily Mail this week. The Daily Mail ran an article being pretty negative about heat pumps. And also, we've talked a lot about EPCs and that they may change to reflect more carbon and move perhaps away from cost. Yep. But the issue about heat pumps, what's your view? Lots of coverage about we should be installing heat pumps. What's the view in terms of an EPC assessor if you have one? Is it worth it?
Well, I think it's important to understand actually the EPC at this point in time doesn't actually recommend a heat pump. So that's a tricky area in itself. I think our consensus is that heat pumps are the way forward. It's going to happen. It's clean energy potentially that it's going to be using. And I think the problem that I've just described earlier is the cost, isn't it? It's all down to the cost. There's a high cost to install them, and that's why the government have said announced the £5,000 incentive, and there's also the cost of the electricity, and that's the big problem there, is that is not reflective in the EPC at the moment. So if you imagine you've got quite an old Victorian property, like we were just talking about, you install a heat pump, it's going to score really low on the scale at the moment. So until the government actually, or until we need to do something with those energy prices, and it is in the strategy as well. They have realised that actually we need to balance these out, remove those green taxes, so that actually they're balanced out, and gas is actually on a level playing field with electricity.
So there will have to be some structural changes in the marketplace if they're going to get to heat pumps being working.
Yeah. I think that there is obviously we realise that there's lots of consultations with manufacturers. We need to make them smaller because at the moment they're quite large. People wouldn't want to see an air source heat pump on the side of their property. We understand that. And also they're quite complex to install, so we need to make them smaller and easier to install, I think is the answer there.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a last question here from Tony. Are there any grants for solid wall insulation? And Tony says tenants are on benefits. So I don't know whether that's grants for landlords or grants for tenants. How would that work, Damien, if you are a landlord with tenants and you want to do something like this?
I think probably should first of all probably should approach the local authority that Tony is in. See if they have any grants, things like that, because I know some local authorities will have them. In terms of a wider scale, national scale, there is nothing at the moment specifically other than the fact that we have what's referred to as ECO, the Energy Companies Obligation. And currently that's the funding pot for that sits within retrofit. So Tony would have to look at find a coordinator and discuss that with the coordinator to go down that route. But there is some funding pot available and it does cover insulation, solid wall insulation.
Excellent. Hopefully, Tony, that will help. So we've overrun. Thank you so much for all your questions. I hope I got to all of them. I just want to finish with Angus. It's quite a moving feast here, isn't it, for landlords? How are they going to navigate their way through all of this?
I think with difficulty, because I don't think it's clear enough what the requirement is, what the timing is, and I think my advice would be, if you're doing something anyway to your property, then clearly, make it, do whatever you can to make it as energy efficient as possible if you're going through a refurb. But other than that, I probably wouldn't rush to do stuff until there's greater clarity. Certainly in terms of, there's no grant available for the heat pumps today. That doesn't start till next April. I think there will be more funding at some point because I think there needs to be more funding to actually encourage some of this stuff. So I think, just have your eyes open in terms of what you're doing. If you can easily get your property to a C, then it's worth it. But if you can't, I think I'm keen that we get as much of our housing population to be more energy efficient. But you've got to balance cost with reality here, and I think just be careful.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Damien, for your time. Thank you, everyone. We will be sending out a recording in case you missed any of it, and we will be back with you in first week of December for the last webinar of the year. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.